You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming to you now, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. The opinions expressed on Long Waves are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, views, or understandings of KYRS's staff management or its underwriters. And thank you for joining me today. It's feeling awfully like April out there, which just seems so terribly wrong to me. But so many things do seem so strange these days. Well, it looks like we've got some sort of end game in the Burns, Oregon story with the Bundy boys. After the arrest of 8 members of the wannabe militias and the fatal shooting of one of them, Finicum, the spokesperson of the group, who often said he'd wanted to go out fighting. So I guess he got his wish, his final wish. And you know, it led me to a long reflection about violence, and violence in America in particular. We have such a lengthy legacy of violence and such a lengthy history of violence that we have so cultivatedly removed from history and just washed away. Whether it's the violent suppression of labor movements, the mine workers in particular in the 19th century, the steel workers in the 20th century, and in the 19th, the suppression of alternate forms of political discourse such as socialism. I said the S word. The amazing thing is how much violence we in this country and we in this culture routinely practice, but are unconscious of as a group. And I'll say more about that later. You know, looking at the Bundys, where did these people get the idea that getting some of their buddies together with a bunch of guns and seizing federal property was going to work out well for them? Well, they drew on this long history of violence, and they talked about themselves as patriots in revolt. Well, you know, they were revolting, I guess, in the same sense the people in the 1700s were revolting in Pennsylvania against the whiskey tax. And, you know, the fate was pretty similar, but that was a foregone conclusion. But the Bundys fit so nicely into the whole gun culture, which proliferates from an ongoing and largely unconscious sense of violence. We're violent as a nation. We're violent in our international affairs. We're violent interpersonally. And we kill 30,000 people a year with guns. So what's going on with this gun violence? Where does the belief come from that A, carrying a gun makes you safer, and B, that, you know, it's somehow an absolute right that you have? Well, they point to the Second Amendment, which, as I've pointed out on previous shows, they really don't understand. Everybody drops that whole, you know, well-regulated militia, and calling you and your ragtag friends of ex-military types with your guns and camo. A militia is absurd in the constitutional sense. But this idea, this frontier notion that it's you against the world and you have an absolute right to defend yourself with violence, even when you're defending yourself, even if you don't shoot, just carrying the gun around, you're defending yourself, demonstrably makes the world less safe. Demonstrably. Accidental discharges, dropped guns, lack of training, alcohol, all of these things. But violence is so inherent that a lot of people seem to almost look forward to violence. You know, as I've mentioned, we hold up perpetrators of great violence as heroes. Think of General Sherman. You know, there's a street right here in Spokane named after General Sherman. Sherman of the March to the Sea, 100 miles wide, burn everything. Sherman, who came up with the genocidal approach to eliminating the Plains Indians by killing their food sources, their buffaloes, and then hunting them individually. Heroes like George Wright, who I've also spoken about, who hanged Indians not a quarter of a mile from where I live, and was absolutely ruthless in seeking to destroy them. But, you know, he gets streets named after him. Andrew Jackson, who conducted the clearances of Indians east of the Mississippi, the Trail of Tears. People, and these were Indians he'd fought with. These were Indians he had spent time with. These were people he had signed treaties with, and all of that could simply be erased in this act of stunning violence, this ethnic cleansing. So we have this going for us in our past, and we never truly examine it in any kind of moral way. And this is the frightening bit of it. And in fact, we continue to expand and modernize and upgrade the violence that we perform both domestically, civilly, and internationally. So this from South Front, which is a Russian military and political analytic website. I recommend them highly. They do very good work. But this article just from today. The United States is expanding its presence in Syria. Did y'all know that? Satellite imagery taken December 28th shows construction underway to extend the runway at the airfield of Rumeilien, Al-Hasaka province, which would prepare the site to accommodate larger aircraft. And there have been reports circulating since, December, early December last year, but the images confirmed that some of these reports are in fact true. So the runway at the airports, the original was 700 meters long, 2,100 feet, give or take. But now it's being more than doubled so that, large troop-carrying kinds of planes could land and take off from there. So the airfield was also at one time captured by the Kurdish People's Protection Units, the YPG, the Kurds fighting up there in northern Syria against both ISIS and the Turkish government and apparently NATO. And they controlled the airport for some years. But anyway, the U.S. has moved in. Quoting again now from South Front, the confirmation of the expanding U.S. presence in Syria arisen amidst militaristic statements of Vice President Joseph Biden, who claimed that the U.S. is ready for a military solution in Syria. And he said this at a press conference with the Turkish premier in Istanbul. U.S. is ready for a military solution in Syria. So, continuing with the article, a day before a ground operation in Iraq and Syria was also announced by the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter. A day before, a ground operation in Iraq and Syria was announced by SecDef Ashton Carter. It stated that the 101st Airborne Division will soon deploy 1,800 troops to Iraq. Oh, my goodness. I'm not sure what the Syrian deployment is supposed to be. The South Front suggests, quote, the U.S.-led military bloc is no doubt surprised by the success of the Syrian Arab Army, supported by the Russian Aerospace Defense Forces, and allegedly of Russian military advisors. And it's also pointed out that since Russia installed a very advanced anti-aircraft missile system, the S-400 in Syria, Turkish airplanes had not been flying into Syria at all. They're afraid of being shot down, in other words. So what seems to be going on? The analysis and intelligence from South Front predicted a month ago, they write, that NATO allies are urgently trying to implement a new plan to hold control of at least the northern oil corridor from Iraq and try to take advantage of this opportunity to involve Russia in a long, expensive war. This plan includes an occupation of crucial infrastructure, including oil fields, by NATO contingents, and establishing of anti-government, meaning anti-Russian and anti-Iranian forces in parts of divided Syria. Well, this is a rather serious escalation, and as South Front points out, implementing this plan could easily lead to global war, launched by military escalation over the Syrian crisis. The stakes of the global geopolitical standoff have been raised again. And doesn't it just amaze you that war after war is begun, continued, expanded, with no debate, no discussion, just the SecDef and the president and a couple of military types. And it looks like we're also going to get involved in Libya again. Here, well, the Moon of Alabama had some reflections on this that I'll get to in a moment. But look at what we got ourselves into. We get stung by hornets. So what do? We run over and stick our hand in the hornet's nest. This is so typical of this imperial thinking of the United States these days, where the damage done, the lives lost, foreign lives, American lives, none of this really matters. The costs, none of it really matters. The $3 trillion run up in Afghanistan and Iraq in the war that Rumsfeld said would take at most 90 days, but he doubted it would go that long. And it would pay for itself in Iraqi oil. What kind of person keeps doubling down on something that fails? What kind of mind is it that doubles down on a consistently failing move? How are we supposed to think of this? These are minds driven by pure ideology, and ideology will block out all of the facts. You know, we used to laugh in this country about how ideologically blinded people were in the communist regime in Russia. You know, with where they wouldn't even admit they had serial killers like Chikatilo, because serial killers cannot exist in the people's state of happiness, and we do not have these disorders. These are disorders you have in a corrupt, decadent Western world. Well, this is exactly that kind of thinking from Ashton Carter and Newland and Kagan. It's exactly that sort of thinking that whatever they have in their minds, by sheer will and the might of the imperial armies, they can bring to happen. And it doesn't matter whether it actually works or not, because there's no one to stop them from doing it again. And in fact, they tend to get promoted, which is just bizarre. So now it appears we're going to get involved with Libya. Let me talk about this, what Moon of Alabama's been saying about this. Imperial violence is a gift that keeps giving. After the U.S. lied to the UN Security Council about alleged Gaddafi threats against protesters in Benghazi, the United Nations Security Council allowed for the use of force to protect them. Russia and China abstained instead of vetoing, probably because they wanted the U.S. to get stuck in a long, drug-out war. So, in Libya in the spring of 2011, the U.S. and its NATO allies abused the UNSC resolution. They weaponized the protesters, bombed the country to smithereens, and killed the leading government figures, including Muammar Gaddafi. Then, U.S. Secretary of State Clinton the Monster famously bragged, "We came, we saw, he died." So, the U.S. trumps up some kind of threat, because we're really good at trumping up threats, gets the UN Security Council to say, yeah, okay, go do some selective bombing to save the protesters. But what, in fact, the U.S. did is it destabilized the whole country. It did massive bombing. And now the U.S. wants to attack Libya again. General Joseph Dunford, quoting again from Moon of Alabama, General Joseph Dunford, Jr., chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told reporters on Friday that military officials were looking to take decisive military action against the Islamic State, or ISIS, in Libya, where Western officials estimate the group has roughly 3,000 fighters. Administration officials say the campaign in Libya could begin in a matter of weeks. They anticipate it would be conducted with the help of a handful of European allies, including Britain, France, and Italy. Well, I guarantee you they're not putting boots on the ground. I think after the Afghan episode, it is extremely unlikely they'd be putting any troops on the ground. But, continuing with the article, this will go as it always goes. Bomb strikes, special forces, proxy fighters trained by the U.S. forces or private companies, who will then develop into their death squads and terrorize the population. And this is pretty much how it plays everywhere, whether it was Costa Rica or Nicaragua or Colombia or Chile or Iraq. It works out this way. These little proxy forces develop into death squads with our training and help and blessing, and then terrorize the population. There is chaos. Quoting again, there's chaos in Libya as was foreseeable and predicted here when the war on Libya began. There are many armed groups and 2 parliaments and 2 rudimentary governments, one in the east and one on the west. The UN just tried to set up a 3rd government and failed. So these rebels, these various loose alliances of armed groups and former rebels who fought against Gaddafi, are now fighting over the bones of Libya and the bones of the Libyan people. Many of these, quoting Moon of Alabama, many of the rebels who were paid by Qatar and others to overthrow the Libyan government are Islamists. Many went from Libya to Syria to fight against the Syrian government, and the U.S. helped to supply weapons from Libya to those foreign terrorists in Syria. It is unlikely that the real U.S. interest now is to fight the few foreign Islamic State fighters in Libya. Most of the Islamic State fighters in Libya are locals of some specific tribes who earlier were part of this or that Islamist gang. They are not a threat, and other local forces will hold them at bay. They suggest, Moon of Alabama suggests that the U.S. really wants the whole country under its control, and that makes sense, from an imperial perspective. But who's going to be the proxy? We've tried at least once to install a proxy. Khalifa Haftar, a general and a former Gaddafi ally, he's around. But he's never really worked out, and he didn't work out in 2011 when the U.S. tried to install him. So they may go back to this again. But think about this as an attempt, as they say, for full control over the country and its resources. And then you can use this as a base to subjugate other countries in northern Africa. But we can see, you and I, unblinded by ideology and perhaps having some small, warm feeling about people in the world who might be killed by our government for no good reason, we can see where this goes. It doesn't improve. It develops more war. Moon of Alabama writes, it will develop more war, more terror, more refugees who will flee their home. The imperial violence keeps giving. And doesn't it just? Doesn't it just? The violence is staggering. The destruction is staggering. I don't know if you're watching the pictures that are coming out of places like Ramadi or Aleppo, but these are not cities anymore. These are piles of rubble. These are piles of partially pulverized concrete mixed with human bodies and shell fragments. That's what's left of these cities. This first wave of immigrants into Europe, refugees from these hellholes, is just the beginning. Simply because there is no place for them to live anymore. You want to liberate Ramadi? You're liberating a tomb and a graveyard. You want to liberate Aleppo or Palmyra? Hugely destroyed cities. Tom Engelhardt from Tom Dispatch, who always has something interesting and clever to say, did address this a bit. He was talking about the victory achieved at Ramadi in Al-Anbar. Right, so the Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh, seized it from the Iraqi army back in May of 2015. It wasn't that long ago. Y'all might remember it. So then the U.S. Air Force gets involved, did some 600 or so airstrikes in and around Ramadi in the months leading up to the victory. And then the U.S. trained and U.S. financed special operations units went in and did largely take most of Ramadi back, even though it had been, as Tom Engelhardt writes, intricately booby-trapped and mined from heavily entrenched ISIS militants in late December. But this is a victory for the Obama administration. A victory after victory. So, Tom writes, and here's what victory turned out to look like. At least 80% of a city of 400,000 was destroyed. 80% of a city of 400,000 was destroyed. Rubbleized, skeletized city may be what it's still called, but it's hardly an accurate description. According to New York Times reporter Ben Hubbard, who visited Ramadi soon after the victory, few inhabitants remained. Of an Iraqi counterterrorism general there with him, Hubbard wrote, "In one neighborhood, he stood before a panorama of wreckage so vast that it was unclear where the original buildings had stood. He paused when asked how residents would return to their homes. Homes, he said, there are no homes." So this is not a little short-term problem, these migrants, these refugees. This is an ongoing problem. It's an ongoing problem of our making. Our making. And we can only talk about little chunks of this madness of destruction and desolation. A city of 400,000 people destroyed, rubbleized. But we did that, that's what we do in Iraq. We bombed them back in the 90s when HW was in business. Clinton continued the blockade of equipment that would allow the Iraqis to rebuild. And then, of course, we, bombed them again. And again. And again. And again. The head of Anbar Provincial Council in Iraq has estimated that rebuilding the city would require $12 billion. Tom writes, "That's money no one has, including an Iraqi government increasingly strapped by plummeting oil prices. And keep in mind," he writes, "that's only a single destroyed community." The victories of the Kurds at Kobane and Sinjar in Syria, also backed by U.S. bombing from the air, destroyed those towns too. Aleppo, Homs, and so it goes, and so it goes. I mentioned before that we are so unconscious of what's going on. Not because it's censored and we can't get access to it, but because we live in a culture of distractions and pleasing lies about ourselves. Distractions and pleasing lies that segue nicely into ignorance and false histories and a true kind of moral callousness that refuses to admit the truth when the stench of the bodies is in the nostrils. I mean, think about it for a minute. If you don't know what's going on in the world, if you don't know about Ramadi and Homs and Aleppo and Palmyra and on and on and on, if you don't know about the millions of people killed, it is easy to feel morally smug, morally superior, and to say, we are not a bad people, we are not a violent people. I think this is even wearing thin these days, but yet the lies get trotted out again and again and again. And this is one sector of the violence. One sector of the violence, the things that we do overseas. So let me get back to the things that we do overseas, and particularly in Ramadi. I'm going to return to Tom's piece here and share a little more of that. So, as we mentioned, the 101st Airborne is going back in, And Ashton Carter was laying out some detail about what their plans were. And he said, the ISIL parent tumor has two centers. Gotta love the metaphor, the parent tumor. This pathology metaphor, because it's completely vilifying, suggests a violent response is needed, and it's something that just happened for some reason we don't know why. Let's go back. The ISIL parent tumor has two centers, Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq. All right. That's why, and this is Ashton Carter continuing, that's why our campaign's map has got two big arrows pointing at both Mosul and Raqqa. Well, it's nice he would explain that to the idiot rest of us, huh? We will begin by collapsing ISIL's control over both of those cities and then engage in, you'll love this, elimination operations. Elimination operations. Well, as Tom points out, such a campaign would give elimination operations new meaning, since it would clearly involve, quite literally, eliminating the urban infrastructure of significant parts of the region. Let that sink in. Eliminating the urban infrastructure of a significant part of the region. That is something you just don't pop back from. That's something, if you can come back from, it may take you years, decades, to rebuild, to reestablish cities, and all that cities is, because they are so much more than concrete and asphalt and power lines. They are history. They are lives lived and living. They're the art we inhabit. To destroy the urban infrastructure is a crime against humanity. But, hey, got to break some eggs to make an omelet. 3 cities, in fact, are presently targeted, continuing with Tom's piece. Fallujah, population perhaps 300,000. The other major ISIS-controlled city in Al-Anbar province. Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, with a population estimated at 1 to 1.5 million. And Raqqa, the Syrian capital of the Islamic State, now reportedly stuffed with refugees, population 200,000 plus. So, really we're just looking at something like somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people made homeless, and really having no place to go to. No place to return to, even if hostilities cease. No jobs, no factories, no hospitals, no schools, no water, no electricity, no sewage. Nothing. Nothing. And this is all part of Ashton Carter and Robert Kagan's brilliant strategies to spread peace and democracy. I want to throw up when I read this. And the Islamic State will make sure that the only way that anyone can take these cities from them would be, as Tom calls it, the rubbleization of yet more cities in the region. This is victory, mind you. This is not defeat we're talking about. Ashton Carter is talking about this as victory. Does it end the war? No. Does it solve the refugee problem? No, it makes it worse. Does it make people freer or better? No, no, no. Will it get rid of ISIS? Actually, it's probably going to generate another backlash. Another backlash. So no, but that'll let us continue the eternal war of destroying more cities and more countries because we are a good and caring people who really just want to spread democracy and liberty and freedom and free markets and free enterprise. That's who we are. And if we've got to kill half the world to do it, by God, well, that's a small price to pay, isn't it? Assuming all went well, Tom writes, we essentially know what the future holds. Ramadi-style victories. We destroyed the cities in order to save them. You remember that army captain with his cigarette, his Zippo lighter in Vietnam, standing there setting fire to some Vietnamese family's home? We destroyed the village in order to save it. You know, that was insane in 1968. It's just criminal now. It is criminal. So, I mean, just talking about money here for a minute. Based on Ramadi, you could then perhaps offer these ballpark, not that any stadiums would be left standing, future estimates for rebuilding. So maybe $10 billion for Fallujah, $7 billion for Raqqa. Mosul would run $20 to $25 billion. These are obviously fantasy figures, he writes, but the point is that success against and victory over the Islamic State would undoubtedly leave much of the region a modern Carthage. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Destroy the city, salt the earth. And who's going to pay for this? Nobody. We'll have just another destroyed country with destroyed people, destroyed lives, and yet we are the good ones. Because ISIS, which we created, ISIS was founded in Abu Ghraib prison when it was controlled by the United States. So, victory, Tom writes, would mean that Iraq would have far fewer habitable cities and a far larger number of displaced people whose resettlement would undoubtedly be subject to ethnic tensions that help fuel the Islamic State in the first place. Exactly. And here's the thing. I'm glad he wrote that. I love that. And here's the thing. You can join the Islamic State in blowing up the physical part of Syria and parts of Iraq, and then eject its fighters from the rubble, but you'll be destroying the means of existence of a vast, increasingly unsettled population. What you might not be able to do in the process is destroy a movement that began in an American military prison in Iraq and has always been a set of ideas. You may simply create a legend. And that's actually a very likely outcome. People in the Middle East tend to have very long memories about such things. It goes on and on and on. And the conflicts that will engulf the world because the U.S. wants to play superpower, hegemon, which is not nearly as cute as Pokemon. If the U.S. wanted to play Pokemon, that would be okay. But hegemon, no. Whole cities, whole countries destroyed. And because it's not on TV, nobody talks about it. You really got to kind of be a news junkie to be on top of these stories. We choose the parts of the story we want to hear. Freedom, liberty, stopping those terrorists. And the rest of it's just not our business. And so we presume that we are innocent. And as Carl Jung once remarked, we compound stupidity with iniquity. We don't know what's going on, so we believe ourselves harmless. And increasingly, so much of our violence doesn't even really look like violence. So much of it is, structural. So much of it is built into systems, and it's stuff that just happens. It doesn't involve cops and military, not always, not directly. It could be something as small as what happened in Flint, Michigan. It could be something that small. It could be something as small as what happened in Hurricane Sandy in New York. You know, the New Yorker wrote at the time about all of how there were all of these supplies that were there for the New York Marathon, right? That there were massive portable generators set up in Central Park which were big enough to power 400 homes in ravaged areas. I'm quoting the article. In ravaged areas like Staten Island, the Rockaways in downtown Manhattan. One of the sponsors of the race, Poland Spring, provided more than 90,000 8-ounce water bottles of water, plus more than 60,000 gallons more along the way. Meanwhile, people in the poor neighborhoods were getting water out of fire hydrants, if the fire hydrants still worked, or they were doing without water. They were doing without power. New York was real quick to get on the stick to make sure that, the right neighborhoods in Manhattan had their power on and everything was cleaned up and spiffy and running right. When you start talking about places like Far Rockaway, well, that's a different story altogether. Right? People were even being told, people without running water, couldn't even flush their toilets, of course. The Bowery Mission, a shelter in Lower Manhattan, was asking for donations of iced tea and Gatorade as an alternative to serving only water to its clients. Other shelters were asking for the same thing. Could the New York Roadrunners, the group who put on the marathon, could the group New York Roadrunners, could they have spared some of the 30,000 or so gallons of Gatorade they distribute each year? And surely there were people out there who, after a very long week, would have appreciated even one of the cans of beer earmarked for the pre-race dinner out of the 18,000 cans provided last year. So, Alan Woods wrote about all this. While thousands of families in devastated neighborhoods had no power, the people could see hundreds of generators lying idly behind barbed wire barriers, awaiting the arrival of marathon runners. This one gesture summed up in people's minds all the arrogant contempt that the wealthy elite have toward the majority. One indignant woman said of the mayor, "He's sitting in there warm and dry while we're out here freezing our butts off. He is delusional." This is the thing Americans haven't gotten their heads around yet. As this social system continues to evolve into an open oligarchy, as your individual, your civic rights, the civic sphere itself continues to dissolve like fairy floss in beer, the people at the top, the ones who are running the show, have as much contempt for you and me as they do for the Iraqis, or the Libyans, or the Syrians, or the Kurds, or the Vietnamese. They have as much contempt for us as they do for those people. We don't matter any more than they do. How come whenever people see governments and large organizations and political parties promising violence on others, it never dawns on people it will occur to them inevitably? And in this case, it certainly will. Why not just let the cities, let the poor areas die? Look at Flint, Michigan. I mean, what the hell was that about? And the tale about Hurricane Sandy. Paul Krugman had a couple of things to say about this. He's not one of my favorite writers, but occasionally he says something I appreciate. Excuse me. In the modern world, Krugman writes, much government spending goes to social insurance programs, things like Social Security, Medicare, and so on, that are supposed to protect citizens from the misfortune of life. Such spending is the subject of fierce political debate, and understandably so. Liberals want to help the poor and unlucky. By liberals, he means Democrats. And conservatives want to let people keep their hard income. So he continues. There should be much less debate, however, about spending on what Econ 101 calls public goods, things that benefit everyone and can't be provided by the private sector. Can't be provided by the private sector. I hope everybody caught that. Okay. Yes, we can differ over exactly how big a military to have or how dense and well-maintained the road network should be, but you wouldn't expect controversy about spending enough to protect key public goods like basic education or safe drinking water. Well, Dr. Krugman, I don't know what universe you're living in, but if you look around, I expect to see it every day because that's how far we've come. He does continue. A funny thing has happened as hardline conservatives have taken over the U.S. governments. Or actually, it's not funny at all. Not surprisingly, they've sought to cut social insurance spending on the poor. Many state governments dislike spending on the poor so much they're rejecting Medicaid expansion that wouldn't cost them anything. But what we also see is extreme penny pinching on public goods. It's easy to come up with examples. Kansas, which made headlines with its failed strategy of cutting taxes in the expectation of an economic miracle. Cut those taxes and load of money will drop from the sky. It's true, I can promise you. Well, no, that never works. But it doesn't stop people from doing it. You see how completely counterfactual and counter-reality ideologues are. So good old Kansas, which had this utterly failed strategy, tried to close the resulting budget gap largely with cuts in education. That's where they always go, cuts in education. North Carolina's also imposed drastic cuts on schools. And in New Jersey, Chris Christie famously canceled a desperately needed rail tunnel under the Hudson. Public construction spending as a share of national income has fallen sharply in recent years. reflecting cutbacks by state and local governments that are ever less interested in providing public goods for the future. And this includes sharp cuts to spending on water supply. So are we just talking about the effects of ideology, Krugman asks? Didn't Flint find itself in the crosshairs of austerity because it's poor, mostly African-American city? Yeah, that's definitely part of what happened. It would be hard to imagine something similar happening to Grosse Pointe. Yeah, and it would. But these really, what he says is what we see in Flint is an all too typically American situation of literally poisonous interaction between ideology and race, in which small government extremists are empowered by the sense of too many voters that good government is simply a giveaway to those people. You think I'm joking when I say your rulers care no more about you and me than they do the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Libyans, the Serbs. No more. And if we cease to be sufficiently productive, well, then you become a sacrifice zone where they decide to put up hideously polluting factories, as they've done around the country, in sacrifice zones of populations that they don't want to spend any money on at all. Not for roads, not for schools, not for hospitals. You've heard the stories of the Michigan schools, yes? Feces coming through the ceiling. Rats running in the hallway. Well, now it turns out, just to close out on this Flint story, it seems to be, and this is still unattributed, but there are some people suggesting that the Detroit sewer and water system had offered to supply clean drinking water 20% cheaper than switching to the polluted water authority. And Occupy Democrats have some quotes here. One saying, the choice of pipeline can only be attributed to a political objective that has nothing to do with the delivery or price of water. And of course, Governor Snyder is refusing to release his emails from the period. Do you think they care about you because what? Why? You're still productive? You live in a part of the world that hasn't turned into a sacrifice zone. Do you know how quickly that can turn around? Even without a war? In a sense, it's not surprising that this has happened, because this is neoliberalism. This is everything reduced to naked cash exchange value. There is no social. There's only individuals pursuing their rational self-interest. Survival of the fittest. We're back to Hobbes. Congratulations, neoliberals. You've almost completely destroyed the world. And that concludes today's show. Sorry for the downer of an ending. I sometimes have trouble coming up with bouncy little endings. But thank you for joining me today. You can write me, rather, longwaves at kyrs.org. Find me on Facebook, Longwaves Radio. Podcasts are on YouTube. And if you've got a car, truck, boat, motorcycle, something like that you want to get rid of, just sitting around doing you no good, you can donate it to us. We'll have it picked up. You'll get a nice tax deduction. We'll get a few bucks to help keep the station running. And we do rely on the generosity of all of you to help us. Thank you for listening. If you're not a member, please join. Oh, I should give you the all-important phone number for the car donation. 855-597-7227. It's free. It's easy. 855-597-7227. I'll be back next week. Till then, well, find a happy thought and hang on to it. Thank you again for listening. I'll be back.